So, hello, Sonja, from a beautiful Cape, lovely sunny Cape here down the south of the country. How are you today?
Well, it is very hot here in Joburg. We're waiting for the rain, and nothing's coming, but we're waiting. So, but I'm happy to be here and to have this chat with you today. Thank you.
Yes, I'm looking forward. As I understand it, this is now kind of a deeper dive into the nature, the essence of this work, of constellation work. So I suggest, if you want, we can start with those basic questions that I think linger in the minds of people when they look at the word family constellations. What is that really about? And maybe you want to have a first shot at defining it in the way. Oh, by the way, I just want to add this because I noticed that as many facilitators there are around the globe, there are as many interpretations of the work. And it's like we need to integrate and incorporate the wisdom of this work to express it in the way that we feel it and see it. So that's why I'm very curious, because you've been working with this for so long, to hear what you say about
it. So when I first came across Family Constellation, the word constellation was very confusing to me. And it's very confusing for a lot of people, because the first thing they always ask is, has it got to do something with the stars? And then my answer is, no, it has nothing to do with the stars. But already the mind has drifted off to something completely different. And then I started looking at the German word, Konstellation. And Bert Hellinger, the father of this work, was German. And so in German, Konstellation, constellation is used for the interaction between people, the interaction between certain elements. So that is how the word constellation actually became what we now know as family constellations. It comes from the German word Konstellation. And so when we now look at it, what we really do is we set up a systemic map. And that's really what a constellation is, in a very simplified way for me at this point in time.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. And immediately what I pick up there, if you say, when you say the interactions between people, I would immediately jump to the question, so are these interactions between people always overt, conscious, aware interactions, or are they also mostly subconscious, overt kind of? Overt, yes, that's the right word. No, hidden. Are they also hidden, these interactions? That we do them like on autopilot, not realizing what the implications of our interactions are about.
Exactly. So when we ask somebody to set up a constellation, so again, the German word is so beautiful. It's stellen. So it is putting them into a configuration. So when they put the people into a configuration, then that is very unconscious, because there is no logic when they place the people. So that's very subconscious. And therefore, there is a trial of some people. They want to do it very logic, and in their logic, they actually get it wrong. So it gives a picture. It immediately creates a picture from which we can work.
Beautiful. Reminds me of the Holland. How do you say Holland or Netherlands? The Dutch word is opstellingen.
Yes.
So also the same effect, that they put it in places, or they put it in a certain ratio or proximity or spatial arrangement from each other. And as you say, the best way to enter this work is to do it with your feelings, almost with an irrational, intuitive placement approach or perspective, and then look at it objectively.
Absolutely. So it is, I think the whole work is, when we look at it, is what does your body say? I instruct my clients to say, set it up according what feels right in your body. And the more you set it up with your body, or you place it with what your body tells you to do, the more accurate we can work from there. There is never a right or a wrong. So I always have this giggle right in the beginning. No matter what you do, you can't get it wrong. And I like that because it puts people at ease right from the word go.
Yeah. So is this an appropriate point then in a conversation to ask the question how it is done? You already started to alert to it, and you gave some clues, but this mentally, process-wise, how does it happen? Does a client arrive with a question in his mind? And what then? What happens after that?
Okay, so we get various clients. Some clients come because they're curious. And as we saw in another self, it is friends drag you to that, and then you get sort of pulled into that. So a lot of people are curious, but I believe all of us have an issue or another. So there is not a person on this world that doesn't have an issue. We all have something that we can, as I say, work with. So, and often a client comes and says, I have this issue, that issue, that issue. I don't know which one to work with. And simply by naming them, all of a sudden these issues have some commonality. And sometimes they sort of flow into another. Although we start with one issue, they sort of seem to flow into another. Sometimes we start with an issue, and whatever we set up ends up in something completely different. So there is no set rule that we as facilitator can say, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to do, this is the movement that's going to happen. Doesn't happen that way.
So we now at the stage where the client, you connect with the client at the beginning of the process. The client sits next to you, the facilitator, and you're asking what are the issues or the questions that you came to the constellation work with. And then the client will start to speak, and through the conversation between you and the client, then will arrive a consensus approach, how to then unpack that in terms of a three-dimensional spatial arrangement. Am I correct in, are you doing it that way as well?
Yes, and that initial chat is actually very important, because sometimes a client is quite confused and they need something to actually bring it down to something that is workable. Sometimes, and it happens extremely little, where a client is not ready for a process. I have had that very on the odd occasion where a client has such a lot of emotion that the overwhelm is already too much to set up a constellation. And then it is best to just allow the overwhelm to come out and then set up a constellation a little bit later, or do something very, very small, a tiny movement, just to bring that overwhelm into something that is manageable for the client. But that I have very, very seldom.
Yeah. Are those situations all indicators that there could possibly some trauma in the system?
It could be that there's a lot of trauma, but every now and again, there's a client who has all the answers already ready, and all they want is the constellation to confirm their answers. And I'm quite wary when a client comes with all the answers already ready, because then I'm thinking, well, if you've got all the answers, why would you want to set up a constellation? Because the constellation may not give you the confirmation that you already have made up your mind to receive.
Anyway, if there's overwhelm, then the indication is there that it's time to slow down and to take small bites at this big monster.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also to gauge where is the client emotionally. How much information is going to be too much? So often when a client speaks, because I sit next to the client, I'm also in the field already with the client. And then I can, because of the experiences that I've already picked up over the years, I can see this is going to be very difficult for the client. And then I make sure, are you really ready to see what may unfold? Because for me, if the client is already, let's say a client came because a friend said, you'll get instant healing from this. And the client has an expectation to get that instant healing. But there is a lot of trauma. Then to unlock all that trauma in one Pandora's box is not a good idea. And then one has to gauge what is possible and what is not possible.
So we keep the well-being of the client throughout the process at the center of the radar all the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. So now let's say we decided that this is going to be a good way to unpack this three-dimensionally, spatially. What's the next step? Or what would be your preference be as a facilitator? What's the next step after that?
So with the discussion with the client, we discuss what is a good healing outcome for the client. I don't like to say we are working towards an outcome, because my focus is when the field is in flow, that would be the outcome. And often the client doesn't have an idea of an outcome. So for me, I internally set the outcome when the field is in flow and the client is in a good space. So really what a client wants is, I just want to feel better. So, but what is it that is needed? Who are the key representatives or representations that we are looking for? Sometimes in a family constellation, we work with people directly, but sometimes we can work with emotions or with what I call abstract elements. So we can do that. And as we saw in Another Self, those abstract elements tend to then become certain people anyway. But then we can work with the direct question that the client has.
Yes. So this is the fork in the road. So we can work with a group where we have physical representatives of certain issues in the constellation, or we can go the inner domain path where I would say it this way, that where the client goes in a semi-meditative state into his inner world and create his inner constellation room in his mind. This is the way I think that COVID and online work has taught us more and more, is to open up that way of working.
Okay, so you're talking about the inner mind's eye and doing a complete constellation in the mind's eye. Yes, that's something we can work with. I mostly work either in a group with people pre-COVID times, and we're slowly going back to that, or I actually have a little turntable and some little figurines that I work with. And then when I work in a group, the people that are in the group do the representations. With other words, they then represent the father, the mother, or whatever. And while I do the movements on the side per instruction of the person that is representing.
So this is a very good way to further evolve the conversation, because there was a very, in my opinion, my perspective, very specific dominant way prior to COVID. That would, let's say that's the group way. Then COVID came and it's pushed us, nudged us to devise more creative and adaptive forms of the work. And so you say that you have these little figurines on your table, you have a second camera that records this movement of the little figurines as the group contributes their opinion online. So
Yes.
it's actually a group, but it's an online group.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So that's what I worked with mostly during COVID, and it is still a good way to work like that at the moment, because my trainees at this point in time are not all living around me, and it allows them to then be in their training for a very specific amount of time. They get the times preset, which means they set that time out from their families. They get dad to look after them for 2 hours, and then it's not a whole day that they are away. So it's a different way of working, yes. But the methodology is still the same, because whether I work in a group, whether I work in person or, as I call, online, the methodology always remains the same.
Right. So then a very general question. So we went into quite a bit of specifics, but I want to move back to the wider scope now and ask this question: how does it actually work? What are your takes on that question, that general question? Okay. How does it work?
So we already said that this is subconsciously, and the way I explain it to people, because people really see this as, what is going on? How do I feel? Why am I having these funny sensations? And even when I started working in groups over Zoom, people still had these sensations, although we weren't in the same room physically next to one another, which is where it becomes really interesting. The coughing starts, or the yawning starts, or the fidgeting starts, and sometimes people literally fall asleep until there's a movement, and then you think, what's going on here? So,
like Ada in the series, where she grabs at her neck.
Yes.
Very skeptical about this work, but eventually she feels this pain.
Exactly. So something's going on. And my general answer is, who cares how you put on the radio? You put on the radio and expect something to come on. You go to a certain station and then you get certain feedback. Nobody questions how the picture gets onto the TV. There's a technically behind it. There's waves behind it. And we as humans are actually the antenna that pick up the waves of the intention of what we discussed with the client before. So I find that even in the discussion, people start tuning in, if that's maybe a word that I want to use here. And often people say, I knew you were going to pick me for that. So people are already sensing where this is going, and they are in their body, but they are not sensing their body. They are sensing information that's coming very naturally. So every human being has this natural sensation that they can pick up in their body. So, for want of a better word, we live in an energy field. Rupert Sheldrake, who actually worked with Bert Hellinger right at the beginning, and it was him and Bert Hellinger together who started asking these questions. And Rupert Sheldrake at that time called it the morphogenic field. Today we call it the quantum field. Energy has no limits. It's not bound to a room. It's not bound to anything else. It is bound to the group of people that have come together with an intention.
I totally love that. So just to be clear, the body then becomes an antenna the moment it steps into that spatial representation. And like you said, like in a radio station, it tunes in, it picks up informational waves or resonances that rings true with that specific representation on behalf of the client.
Yes.
So it's like a radio station. You dial, you fine tune, and whoops, there's the radio station. So similarly, this work is about finding a wavelength or a resonance with the information that needs to be expressed through the antenna of the representation.
Yes. And it may not make sense to the representative at that moment as to what he or she is experiencing. And mostly it doesn't make sense. It's like, this is not me. It doesn't make sense to me, but then it doesn't have to make sense to the representative. The representative only has one goal: to give the information that is happening in the body. And I generally do not ask what you think. I generally ask, and what's happening in your body now? Because the body is so tuned in and the body cannot lie. When we start thinking, we start developing all sorts of thoughts that may or may not be true. So when I say, what's happening in your body? The body does not lie. The body is very accurate in the representation. The only person who needs to make sense of this is the client. And
Absolutely.
that is why I check in with a client and say, I don't understand what's going on here. Does it make sense to you? And the client will say, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. That is exactly how my father always spoke. And that's exactly how my mother always spoke. Right. That's a confirmation. And it's not that the father is in the room. It's not that the mother is in the room. It is not that we have entities coming into the room. It is simply an energy. And where does the energy come from? Let's be honest. It comes from the client, him or herself, because the client already brings that energy into the room.
So once we had a mathematician that stepped in as a representative, and of course, he's very rational, things has to be logic, everything must be explained with mathematical equations, there's a certain logic to his whole perspective, and his report was, oh, I feel nothing. So I've noticed some facilitators then will try and fix this representative and say, no, you're too in your left brain, or this and that and the other. In this case, the surprise came from the client. Well, that's exactly how the situation is reporting. He always feels nothing.
Exactly. So again, there are no mistakes. And so I really trust what we call the field as accurate.
So I think we've covered a lot of curious sharing information bits here, enough for a lot of questions to be raised now. So I'm really looking forward what questions will flow out of this bit of sharing. So maybe another question that is a very relevant question for the time that we now live in, and that is, how is this work important for the world right now?
Okay, I'm very biased. How's this work not important? And one of the reasons I started this work is I wanted quick answers for my trauma clients. I didn't want to have long session after session not finding what is going on. And therefore, this is the only methodology I have found so far. There may be others, but this is the only methodology that I found so far that gives me instant insights, that makes sense to the client. There is a shift because the field, the energy in the field shifts. So we already have then what I call an alignment experience. With other words, all the factors that were misaligned come into alignment. And how do we know that alignment? Because there is a breathing that happens in the field, and there's a flow of breathing that happens in the field, and people feel, everybody that represents says, now I feel good. And that's how I generally know the constellation has come to an end, when everybody in the field feels good. And obviously the client will say, wow, I never saw that. I never knew that. That makes so much sense. Thank you. I feel so much lighter. So that is really what I sort of like to have as a result. I have lost your question. I get so excited.
You haven't lost it. It's a perfect place for me to ask it again, maybe in a different way. And that is, given what the world state is right now, I mean, right now, we're looking at the possibility. We don't want to create our thoughts, but we all, as a collective on the planet, have this fear, this anxiety that somebody could just push a button and havoc will. So a lot of anxiety at the moment. So a lot of people are contracted. They are protective. They're holding back. They're closing up. Money is not spent. There's a fear of anxiety. And we can easily say it's worldwide, easily.
Yes.
So in that context, what does this work do for humans? What can it do? What's the possibility?
Okay, so as I experience in the workshops, I find that in the workshop, the group dynamic becomes, wow, what you experience, I'm also experiencing. So in this group workshop, we already learned that we are all one. So in this micro group that we work in, we then realize, hang on, if I'm all one with strangers, am I not all one in a bigger community? And when we look at the world as it is now, yes, there is a lot of I am better than you. So the old way of the ego is really playing out, but we're all experiencing it at the same time. We all are part of the different wars across the world. They impact each of us in one form or another. And now we are very conscious of the impact of something that's happening on the other side of the world that's now impacting my life. And that consciousness is becoming really part of this is in your face. Now, if I look at it, the whole world is in fear. So that's a global consciousness. But I'm so happy to know that when we do this work, there is a part of us that says, wow, we can lift this fear. And even if we lift it one constellation after the next. So I want to share something that I had a chit chat with an ex-trainee of mine. And she asked me, how are you? And so on. And when I started this work, my life was really quite a bit chaotic. And her words were, wow, Sonja, your life, everything's come together. Your family's come together. Everything's come together. And my answer was, that's why I do this work. But this is the thing is, if we are not even connecting in a good way with our families, how can we connect in a good way with our neighbors, our neighboring country, in the global consciousness? So this work is so relevant if we want to play one small part in creating new consciousness in this world.
So is it true to say that when we're in a fear state, in a contractive state, we close our hearts?
Yes.
And that results in we don't feel anymore. We suppress our feelings, even if it's fear. And is it true that perhaps this work helps us to open our hearts so that we can feel and breathe and see each other for what we are?
Well, our hearts are closed, not because we want to keep them closed. Our hearts are closed and our fear is developed from the traumas that we are experiencing in the world. And the more trauma we experience, the more we don't allow our body to feel, because when our body feels, it has to deal with the pain that it feels. And our body is designed to protect itself from feeling that pain, because I need my brain to rationalize on how I can go forward. And feelings are not part of rationalization, so they confuse us. So that is why when there is a lot of trauma, our body protects us by not allowing us to feel the pain. So we live, especially in the Western society, the more you can contain your pain, the more effective you can work. So that used to be the truth. The truth is changing. Fortunately, we're moving into a world where we're talking a lot more about mental illnesses. But I have another issue with that. Mental illness, where does the mental illness start? It starts when we do not give access to what we feel. It is human to feel, and we need to feel our pain so that we can address it, work through it. And the more we do that, the more our heart opens, because in the essence of who we are as humans, in our soul essence, we are unconditional love. And we need to bring ourselves to feel it, to acknowledge it, and to be part of it.
So here comes another question, and maybe it's a little bit more complicated question. I don't know. I'd love to hear your take on it. In the last 10, 20 years, 10, 15 years, the word emotional intelligence became quite fashionable, especially in corporate. And so everybody's doing emotional intelligence workshops and so on. So not to discount any of them, but I just want to ask you your take on the difference between this work and emotional intelligence, let's say, training of sorts. What do you think?
I embrace the emotional intelligence. But if it is a field on its own, then it cannot be aligned. And this work is an alignment of the mental intelligence, the emotional intelligence, and then I would like to call it the soul intelligence, which we call our higher self or God or whatever. So I don't like to put anything in a box and take it out of the wholeness, because what we're really striving for is wholeness, which means all belongs, all intelligence have equal space. And I love the work that the Heart Math Institute is doing, where they say we need to bring our heart matter and our mind matter together and let the flow be with that. And what I'm finding is when you do that, the soul flows.
Wonderful. So these presentations that we now offering, talk about and share are also for the coaches out there, coaches that are working as life coaches. Some of them are working as business coaches, some of them working as team coaches, executive coaches. In summary then, for today, what would you say it could be the valuable insights that could be helpful to coaches when they employ these skills and practice them in their relationship to their clients in the corporate environment?
First of all, because there is so much emphasis at the moment on mental wellness. Everybody's talking about mental wellness. And when is mental wellness complete? When the people feel complete, when there's wholeness. And each organization needs to come into alignment as well, because it's got people that have families at home, that have issues at home, those people need to be accommodated. Their emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness needs to be acknowledged. And so that is a huge, huge, huge focus that every company has. And so as coaches, aren't we so well equipped when we bring this work into the workplace, into the corporates, and into our families? So I do not see, again, I'm biased because I never work without this work as a coach. I just get so many results so quick, and it takes all this thinking and logic out of the way. People know when they feel well, and when they've done a constellation, it just makes sense. In my mind, if you don't do this work as a coach, you are not giving your client your best potential.
I'm so glad that you take this angle. I recently watched this beautiful clip from Professor Ian McGilchrist, who spoke about the master and his emissary, or the right brain and the relationship to the left brain. And he specifically referenced in that conversation the propensity in corporate and business to always think about logic and left brain as the only remedy, the linear thinking as the only remedy for finding solutions for the problems that we have in the world. And his statement says that is on a cul-de-sac, it's on a dead-end street, because we really need to connect to the right brain, which he described as the portal to a much wider perspective of our humanness, and which allow us into a much higher level of lateral thinking, creative thinking, which is, I think, what is corporate really needing at the moment. You and I have spoken about this before, but Einstein, who said, you cannot solve the problems at the same level of thinking that created the problems in the first place. So the right brain thinking, the intuitive, the hard math, as you call it, opens us up to a much wider perspective on how to solve our corporate, our business, our team challenges that we have. And as coaches, enables us to open those doors to real solutions, perhaps, what is the word, but sustainable solutions for the future. So I can't encourage people listening to this enough to allow themselves the experience of getting to know this work better.
I absolutely agree, because I have an idea that most of our youth, our young leaders, are frustrated with old styles of management. They are out there. They want to be creative. They want to do something new. But again, when we do it with this work, there is a creativity in it, but there is a safe place in it. Because when we set up a constellation and we do a constellation for a company, you do the mistakes in the constellation, you can see the outcome. So you can course direct in a constellation, which means you don't course direct in real life. And I think that is the number one reason why this is important in the workplace.
Thank you.